Hello, everyone. Welcome to our webinar on systems thinking and for impact investing and impact measurement. We're just going to give it another minute to allow everyone to come in, and then we'll get started shortly. Okay, I think we will get started. Welcome. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you're joining from. I'm Karim Harji, the Program Director of the Oxford Impact Measurement Program. We're delighted you can join us. This is a really interesting topic around how to think about bringing a systems lens to the work we do in impact investing and impact measurement. I'm joined by three other excellent speakers who I'm going to introduce shortly. And I just want to give a very brief introduction to why we're situating this topic within the realm of the work that we do at the Site Business School, particularly around our executive education programs. In the impact measurement program that I lead, we have this critical framework where we try and assess this set of questions around thinking about why we measure what we measure before we get into the how and decision implications. And that's important because we're really trying to step back and both be critical, but also not lose the kind of trees for the forest or forest for the trees. We really want to be able to situate measurement in the right ways to be able to ask questions that allow organizations and also collectives to be able to be thoughtful about what is the role of measurement. How do we also then shift the way that we act in response to the things that we're finding, and fundamentally also rethink some of our approaches to how conventional impact measurement has been done in order to be able to integrate new perspectives, be clear about our framing, and also just think about the ways in which we're engaging in ways that have meaningful measurement, measurement that supports the work that we're doing rather than is at odds with it. And so if you're interested in the program, scan the QR code, and we have a link here. Christine, my colleague here, is also going to share her contact information and more about the program if you're interested. Now, what's interesting is that when we talk about systems thinking, which we'll cover in a minute, we see this play out across our program portfolio. We've got three different programs, including Impact Finance Innovations and Impact Investing. And these are just some of the highlights around how we see these ideas around systems thinking show up within the program. So everything from thinking about impact across asset classes, looking at blended finance, incentives, and technology, but also how you might situate wicked problems, the spectrum of capital, and thinking about the role of impact investment at national and regional levels. And so what are we going to do today? I'm going to introduce this context around systems thinking for impact investing, just to be able to introduce the practice research. We're then going to talk a little bit about the framework that we've developed through work with Rockefeller Philanthropy Advisors, and provide some actionable strategies around how impact investors are moving from these ideas around incorporating a systems lens to actually then bringing it into their work. We'll then get even more tangible using the examples of two leading organizations, Access and Acumen, and you'll hear from both Lydia and Julia. And we'll then have a facilitated discussion with your questions. And towards the last part, we're going to introduce you and preview some of the tools and questions that you can use to get started as a preview to what you can expect to see over the next few weeks and months. As a reminder, this webinar is being recorded. The recording and the slides are going to be shared with you next week. And you can interact with us through the Q&A. So please provide your questions through Q&A. We'll try and respond as we go, and then we'll pick those up also later on. And in the chat, I think as you're already doing, please introduce yourself. Let us know where you're coming from, and we will try and make this a lively discussion between all of us. And there's a lot here that we want to share, but think about this as a preview to the kind of discussions that we have in the classroom, but also that we want to continue beyond this webinar. So I'll briefly introduce the speakers here. I've already talked about my role as the program director. I'm also an advisor to the Shifting Systems Initiative at Rockefeller Philanthropy Advisors, where I work closely with Alex Alvarez, who's the vice president for Europe at RPA. We've been working on this project now for about a year, and we're delighted to be able to share these findings, which we also previewed a couple of weeks ago at the SCORE World Forum. I'm also lucky to be able to work closely with Julia Mensing, who's the head of Impact at Acumen. She's also a guest faculty in the Impact Measurement Program and has been with us for several years. And Lydia Levy, who's the head of Impact and Evaluation at Access, the Foundation for Social Investment. I recently got to know them quite well. And Emily Goodall, one of their board members, also teaches in our program. And so there's a lot of connections to the program content and almost a preview of the kinds of discussions that we have. And our goal today is to begin to give you a bit of an insight into how each of us are doing our work as we bring systems thinking into this era of impact investing and impact measurement in really challenging times. We're all dealing with complexity, and we want to be able to think about new ways to approach some of the conventional practices here. So welcome to all of our speakers. There's increasing interest in systems thinking. This is just a really short snapshot of a few documents that have come out in the last year. You see some guides around for investors from CSP, the Transcap Initiative, TWIST, which is a collective, and the Investment Integration Project, which is looking at institutional investors. Now, what's helpful is that there are some collectives and organizations thinking about these issues around how you bring a systems frame to the work that we do around allocating capital for social and environmental impact. Now, why is this important, or why is this timely? It's because on one hand, there's a lot of capital already flowing. There's a little bit of frustration with the amount of transformational impact it's having. We know that there is impact. We've made progress around impact measurement, but we also want to be able to try and understand what is the aggregate shift that is occurring when all of this capital that's seeking intentional social environmental impact gets directed in the ways that it has been in creative ways. Often we want to be able to understand what is changing and also recognize we're operating in complexity, and some of the approaches and tools we have haven't yet been built or adapted successfully for the world that we now find ourselves in. Thankfully, we're beginning to see a lot of cross-pollination in work in philanthropy and impact investing. This is the Shifting Systems Initiative work that Alex and colleagues have been leading. And we see from the investor side that there's also an appreciation that not only there is upside in having a systems perspective, but also there are systemic risks that are now becoming much more prevalent within portfolios, and therefore we need to be more thoughtful about how we integrate those in our work. This includes, but is not only related to, moving beyond this idea of ESG, which is you start with ESG perhaps, but really want to get at the deep impact. What are the transformational shifts that are occurring, and how would we begin to engage with that regardless of where we are in terms of our strategies and starting points? If you're new to this topic and some of the jargon is unfamiliar to you, I'd encourage you to start here with the Impact Investing Handbook from RPA. We'll be sharing all of these links with you in the follow-up email as well. And this takes you through a step-by-step process around how you will begin to think about what systems perspectives are as an asset owner. And you can see some of the subheadings here around how you work through different elements of systems thinking, as well as building theories of change. And in the last chapter, chapter 5 here listed, around how you might introduce impact measurement and management, which actually maps quite closely to the critical framework I shared with you that we use in the program. So if you're new to this, start here. There's a lot of guidance and some really helpful questions and examples in this document. What we're trying to do today is take and build on a lot of what has come before in terms of these documents, and also then think about how we move to practice. And so the goal of this work is not necessarily to revisit some of the conceptual pieces. It is to think about, well, what do they mean in practice? And as we think about those key elements we're trying to integrate in our work, 4 stand out. The first is that we want to be able to embrace broader perspectives, not just think about this in a transactional way. We want to be able to acknowledge that we're, as impact investors, we're really trying to use capital and our transactions in a larger ecosystem and to be able to think about how those transactions fit into a broader range of activity. In doing so, we want to integrate these systems dynamics. We recognize that we're operating in complex systems. We want to be able to ensure that our processes and approaches are actually designed for that rather than operating or designed for a linear world that we might not be working in. We also want to situate financial capital. We know that financial capital is important in whatever form, but also it's part of usually the broader toolkit that we have and bring, which includes a range of non-financial supports and perhaps also a range of financial capital. And finally, we want to be able to get at some of the underlying issues, not just the symptoms. And for those of you that work in systems change and systems oriented approaches, this is not new, but we will unpack some of the nuances that come with applying this into impact investing. And what's important to recognize is that we will talk as much about the action, so how we shift the ways we design and implement strategies, but it's also about how we shift how we see the world, the mindsets that we bring to this work. And so you'll see this dual perspective play out when each of us talks about how systems thinking is showing up in our work, but also in how it might show up in your own work. And as we move from concepts to practices, our first publication through this series, which we will share with you, is the primer. And the primer is really meant to be an introduction to some of what I've just covered. And it provides a range of entry points for impact investors, regardless of where you are on your journey around integrating systems thinking, to be able to then think about these concepts, how they may play out across different parts of your investment processes, and then accompanied by a toolkit that allows you to integrate those as different part of your ways in which you both design and implement impact investing strategies, but also around your impact measurement and management processes. As you'll see shortly, the goal here is to begin to bridge the concepts to practice divide, which can be quite challenging. It's also importantly to offer possibilities, not prescriptions. We're not trying to tell you what you should do. We're trying to offer a range of ways how you could proceed, drawing on the experiences of practitioners and investors. And because we know that there's a lot of variation in how investors engage, we want to provide options, combinations, and starting points. And today we're going to preview some of those, and the primer will provide a bit more of a menu, and the toolkit provides a bit more guidance. When we built this work, and for those of you that are on the call today, we had 4 audiences and use cases in mind. And for our webinar today, we're going to highlight particularly 2, but it also references, and is relevant to some of the other categories. Today, many of you are here because you're interested in impact measurement and management. We'll be talking quite a bit about that, and all of us have brought that frame of reference to our work, but also impact investing strategies. And again, this is where the work from the Shifting Systems Initiative and Alex in particular are beginning to think through what it means when you're starting out and building strategies. How can you be more deliberate about bringing a systems frame in? A lot of what Lydia, Julia, and I spend time on is how do you integrate across investment strategies, impact measurement strategies, and broadly the ways in which that our organizations and collectives can begin to work more seamlessly together. And so as a very quick preview, before we get into the examples, I wanted to share a summary of the framework and the findings from this report. And as I said, there's more detail here to follow. What we end up doing is we conducted a series of interviews. We reviewed the literature around practice in particular, and tried to understand what changes when you bring a systems orientation to impact investing and to impact measurement. And we came up with these 6 categories inductively through this research. Now, what we're trying to do here is to try and find a way to organize, in some cases, what's already happening, but also to provide some guidance as you work through the different components of what systems thinking implies in your work. And so don't take these 6 components as dogmatic. We think that these are helpful ways to organize how you might engage. They're also not sequential in that you could start in any one of these buckets and move outward. You can take the combination that works for you. And you can also just think about how you might add and deepen your work in any one of these areas. What we're going to do today is we're going to focus on particularly the ones related to impact measurement, 5 and 6. But I'm going to give you a bit of a preview of what we heard in the other 4, just to be able to situate this work more expansively for the range of our audiences that we have today. And this is, again, designed to meet you where you are. So take what is most comfortable for you, but also recognize that in doing so, you have an entry point and you can move further beyond that. So how do we think about this in terms of its components? The first 4 components include how we might value just the idea of working in a systems orientation. One of those things is that we want to be able to shift from this idea of the world is a linear kind of construct to really acknowledging that we operate in complexity. And this changes the way that we think about how we design strategies, how we build our goals, and how we might recognize different sources of data and perspectives. Now, there's a lot underneath this, but fundamentally, it is elevating the importance of bringing a systems lens to all parts of the work, which means that as an organization, you have to work with your different teams in order to do that. We'll preview a tool around how to be able to do that in order to surface some of the expectations and beliefs around valuing systems perspectives across your organizations. Component 2 is around reimagining the way that we deploy capital. And why this is important is because often we have a range of tools of capital that are available to us, and we shouldn't be narrow around how we think about that. Whether you're deploying debt or equity, whether you have some flexibility around your time horizon, whether you are able to leverage and co-invest with others, all those provide a new set of opportunities around how to move from a transactional orientation to something that feels more transformative. And this links to component 3, where we're trying to bridge this idea of working not just from transactions up, but also thinking about this idea of how portfolios can be deliberately constructed to be targeted towards the challenging social environmental issues by targeting leverage points, by shifting the way that we think about what alignment and screening and selection criteria look like from a systems lens, not just a risk or narrow impact lens. And part of this involves shifting our time horizon. In many cases, when we're looking at a systems perspective, we have to shift the way that we think about how we operate in the short term and the bridge to the long-term futures that we're hoping to be able to be part of. And one big way we do that is by changing the way that we interact with our ecosystem. This obviously includes investees, both current and prospective, but it also involves a range of other components, including how we might think about being part of collective impact initiatives, developing shared accountability for systemic outcomes, because often it's quite difficult to trace what you do at a transaction level to a systemic outcome. But when you design portfolios to be able to attract some of those target leverage points, and you begin to construct with others how you might bring your capital and non-financial resources, all of a sudden a range of possibilities can get unlocked. And so I'm going to spend just a couple of minutes to dive a little bit deeper on components 5 and 6 to give you a bit of a sense of how we've presented all of the 6 components in the primer, because this allows you to have these multiple entry points, but also are meant to give you some inspiration around where to start or where you could go. For each of the components, which I covered very quickly, we've introduced the basis of the shift from conventional practice. You can see here that we're reframing IMM as being about adaptability and learning, which is a shift from the more conventional static compliance oriented annual reporting format that we see quite prevalent in the industry today. Now, when you make this shift, it really changes a number of different things. One is that you begin to then acknowledge that you have to be more adaptive and you have to bring learning in at multiple levels of your organization. Now, there are a number of ways you could do that. You can start by just saying, how do we trace what we're learning around the ways in which we invest or measure? And bring that alongside the work that you share around your KPIs in your annual report. If you want to be super ambitious, you could then begin to build out resources and a platform for how you might engage your partners around this kind of learning agenda in a collective way. And we're already seeing investors do that. Other ways to think about this would be, can you embrace an experimentation and iterative learning approach? because sometimes there's this temptation to try and get your investments all right. Now, certainly from a financial risk and return perspective, it's important to have a discipline. But from a outsized impact and transformation perspective, it's not always straightforward to be able to get there. And so trying to think about how you bring this in a rigorous way is another shift that this kind of work implies. Now, you can start by just having quarterly reviews and thinking about how you might be more disciplined around tracking what you're learning and how you're sharing that. And over time, develop more sophisticated ways to think about how the scenarios that you are working towards are actually coming to life. And there's other ways to begin to think about the future and how the portfolios you're constructing might fit into that. A big shift for impact investors is this third one, which is reconceptualizing accountability and additionality. Now, there's been a lot of work that's been done around how we might move from an attribution mindset to a contribution mindset, particularly in complex systems. But really, we can start small. You can start by just asking, how would you trace first and second order effects from an investment? What are the ways in which you can begin to anticipate these amplifications or the ripple effects of any investment before you make a decision, but also more deliberately through the first couple of years? And then over time, think about how you might be able to trace that in a more sophisticated way. And so these provide starting points, but also some points of ambition. And these were all derived from the ways we see investors already thinking about their work. Similarly, not only do we have to look at it from an organizational perspective, which is what component 5 was looking at, we have to think about it from a collective perspective, which involves often widening the scope of the things that we measure, bringing new sources of data and perspectives into our work, and developing new indicators around how we map what is changing within the systems we work in. These are often both organizational specific and collective. So we have to work together around this. A couple of highlights here are around, if you're doing a deal, just think about how you might include one indicator that is more looking at systems level flows and changes as opposed to just transaction level or organizational level. Maybe you bring in some new data. Maybe you try and think about the ways in which you'll be able to build this with others in order to be able to just get new kinds of insights around your learning. And so there's a lot more to say here. And what we've done in the primer is to try and build these out as starting points, as inspiration, but also to introduce you to a set of examples of organizations that are actually doing this. So we've got 6 examples laid out in the primer. Later in the year, we're going to go deeper around how each of them have been able to construct different components and tools and frameworks. But today, we wanted to introduce you to 2 of them, Access and Acumen, and to be able to show how they've taken on 2 components each in their work. And so with that, I'm going to hand it over to Lydia from Access, who's going to take us through how Access built systems thinking more deliberately, particularly into their strategy work. But as you'll see, get on the other side of complexity in order to be able to inform how you think about systems thinking around KPIs and bring that into something that's quite manageable for an organizational perspective. So with that, Lydia, over to you.
Thanks so much, Kareem. So yes, I'm Lydia Levy, Director of Impact and Evaluation at Access, the Foundation for Social Investment. We work to help community charities and social enterprises in England access the finance they need. And as Kareem said, today I'm going to be talking about specifically how we use systems thinking and a systems approach when we refreshed our strategy last year. But really that bit about how we move from the complexity of mapping our system to a set of 5 organizational key performance indicators or KPIs. So it's worth mentioning that thinking at a systemic level was not new for us at Access, but this strategy process was the first time we were so explicit about applying the tools and language of systems change. We obviously undertook some systems, stakeholder, and leverage point mapping with one of the many maps that we did on the slide here. But we also spent a lot of time working to understand the challenges we are seeing in the system and the signals across the system about where our work and that of others was successfully addressing these challenges so far. Because we weren't starting from scratch, we'd already been working to try and understand what was working so far in the system. I think if I had to pinpoint 2 things from that sort of systems approach at this higher level that really made a difference to the strategy process, It was firstly the time we spent being very explicit about where the system was not currently resilient and therefore was not serving charities and social enterprises. This meant putting charities and social enterprises at the heart of the mapping we did, as you can see here, rather than starting with us as Access at the centre. And then I think secondly, it was really about moving beyond focusing on our capital flows. So the programs we're funding and the investments we're making, to understanding the resilience of each of the component parts of the system. I think with a specific focus on those we work most closely with, such as social investment providers, and I'll talk quite a bit more about this as I go through. This was also really key to designing our theory of change, which I will move on to. Thanks. So you can see from this early, I'm going to kind of compare an early version of our theory of change. This one's from 2016 to 2018 with our current one, just to kind of demonstrate how the systems work really kind of practically changed our theory of change. As an organisation that was originally meant to have a limited life, we've always had a big focus on learning as part of our legacy planning. But as you can see from our first theory of change, we are still at this stage very focused on a linear logic model of how we felt change happened, with our programs and our specific approaches being the starting point. This theory of change also had no specific focus on when the outcomes within it would be achieved. I mean, it's a strategy, but there's no kind of detail within the theory of change exactly when kind of we might see any of these outcomes happening. So if we move into our new theory of change, which I admit has ended up being much more complex, so apologies to all for the small print. This came together quite easily, I'd say, as part of the overall strategy process, mostly because we had already done extensive work to understand the 6 challenges we had identified that were stopping our ecosystem from being resilient. And so we knew that. We also knew the specific levers that we could pull to address these. So you can see on the left, funding, mobilizing and sharing. And we had our vision of what a more resilient ecosystem for all looked like. By mapping out the signals of success, we also already knew some of the longer term outcomes we were looking for in the system. So it really all sort of came together from the earlier work that we'd done to kind of think about the system that we were working within. I think my main takeaways from our theory of change process would be firstly that the time you spend on systems thinking in your strategy process will both speed up your theory of change development and give you a theory of change that much more effectively represents the realities of the challenges you're trying to address, rather than being focused sort of simply around you as an organisation. And I'd say, secondly, in order to stop our theory of change becoming too abstract and complex, it was extremely important to me that we were honest with ourselves and our board about what explicitly we felt could be achieved during the 4 years of our strategy. And that you can see that represented here on the left-hand side. Again, it's the 2024 to 2028 time period. And that's why, that was really important to make sure that it kind of didn't go off into the kind of realms of extreme complexity. And that time-bound period, and specifically our KPIs, brings us on to our next bit of the strategy process. So I'm not going to spend too much time looking at the full KPIs. We're instead going to dive into a couple of specific ones so I can show you the kind of the specific component parts to each of those. I should say we report on these KPIs annually to our board in May. So what you're seeing here is from last year's reporting cycle. Putting together the KPIs, I'd say, was a balance of pragmatism and trying to be ambitious about the way that we were seeing our system. I'm the only person who works on impact and evaluation full-time at Access. So we needed a manageable number both for reporting and learning processes, but we also wanted them to capture the complexity of the work that we put into our strategy and the kind of the systemic thinking that sat behind it. You'll see that we ended up with a balance of different levels of KPIs, with some focused more on the flows of capital, some on overall resilience of the system, and one on the wider ecosystem behaviour, which I'd say is probably the hardest to measure. And I'll take you through one from each from the first 2 themes. Firstly, KPI 1. This first KPI looks at whether investment is flowing to charities and social enterprises who would otherwise not be able to access it. A resilient system really should be enabling this. So this KPI is essential for understanding whether the system is showing up and helping those organisations, charities and social enterprises at the heart of it, kind of going back to our strategy again. We're also one of the few providers of grant into blended finance in England, meaning that if we aren't reaching those smaller community organisations, they are unlikely to have access to any form of many, or probably any other forms of social investment or blended finance. As with all of our KPIs, the metrics that sit behind it are a mix of quantitative and qualitative, with each one weighted based on our assessment of its importance in achieving the overall KPI. The first metric for this one specifically draws on a bigger data set that focuses on all social investment in the UK, and that's collected by our sister organisation, Better Society Capital. By comparing our average deal size with the rest of the market, we can see that we're delivering deals that are 10 times smaller than the rest of the market, which matches what we know about the size of deal that charities and social enterprises are looking for, which is around 80k. We've been using this data set for a number of years to conduct this analysis, but not reporting specifically on or kind of explicitly on these findings to our board in a KPI form, nor really using these findings to learn as much. So that was a shift as part of this KPI process. And then if we move on to the second example, we've got a KPI which explicitly here looks at the resilience of the social investors we work with. This matters, as I mentioned, I've mentioned them during the strategy process, but this really matters to us because they play a central role in our ecosystem. Without resilient and well-capitalized social investors, charities and social enterprises simply are not going to receive support. So they're a key, really, really key part of our ecosystem. With this KPI, we started off thinking we would be able to define what a resilient social investor looked like relatively easily. However, it quickly became apparent that our social investor partners all have such different business models that there was no one set of metrics that could be applied across them all. Instead, we've been working with all our partners to develop individual resilience metrics that are meaningful to them and that we can review together annually. We also have a second metric here that looks more at whether we are adequately covering our social investor partners' costs in our funds. And I think if I were to kind of pull out some kind of a key lesson or kind of some key thoughts about these two KPIs, and generally around the 5 KPIs that we put together, it's that a systems lens does not mean giving up on clearly measurable metrics. It means making effective use of the data sets you already have access to, such as the VSC one that we're using in KPI 1. I'd say, well, having to also create some new, potentially slightly more subjective measures for things, such as social investor resilience that you can see here, that are going to be really central to understanding your system health. I've also shown you a couple of KPIs here that are the ones that we're capturing annually. We do, as I said, have a 5th KPI that looks more at ecosystem health, and one of the metrics that sits under that is about the funding levels in our system. Kind of, are we crowding in additional funding for blended finance? And that's a slightly longer term metric in recognition that it's not something that's going to change substantially in 1 year. So I think there's something there around flexibility. Not each of your KPIs is going to look the same and not necessarily always going to be easy to measure annually, but we've done our best to find ones that are. So I'm going to leave there. That was very much a whistle-stop tour through our strategy, theory change, and KPI development. But yeah, looking forward to questions. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Lydia. And just to reinforce a couple of the points that Lydia mentioned, it is bringing the complexity in context of the vision and the mission of the organization to be able to make this shift more deliberately to thinking about who are we working with and on behalf of, and what are the ways in which we'll hold ourselves accountable for that. Again, this is what good measurement should help you do. But also, as you see with Lydia's presentation, this idea of getting to the other side of that complexity, but not losing the complexity and nuance, because there's a learning component that is so strongly built in here that finds the right balance of aggregate numbers, disaggregated data, and the ways in which you can think about the relationship to different kinds of decision making. So even where you see things like the targets and baselines and timescales, and these all bring in a systems orientation in a way that acknowledges that we have to operate in the systems we work in, but also we can shift the way that we work progressively and build a different cadence around how we think about the kinds of data we collect, how we use it, and the ways in which we can work with others in order to be able to just have a more collective approach. And I think it's so emblematic of the ways in which many other foundations, for example, in this case, should be working. And we'll get into that in some of the discussion as well. So thanks, Lydia, for sharing all of this with us. I know it's hot off the press just in terms of the kinds of things that you'll be sharing with your board shortly. Why don't we now go over to Julia, who's going to talk about how this plays out in the context of Acumen's work. Many of you know Acumen. and Julia will briefly introduce what they do and then take us through a couple of components around how they've embedded systems thinking into their work. So Julia, over to you.
Thanks, Kareem. I'll start by taking you all back. If we can just go back to the first slide still before we go into taking you back to the 9th of June in 2021, which is the first day in which I started as the head of impact at Acumen. And it was very exciting for me, having worked in academia, in international development, and for 2 other impact investors, to now start at Acumen, an organization that is known for its impact investing and its patient capital approach, or longer term horizons, 10 to 12 years, rather than shorter transactions. And also, they're known for their lean data approach, which is a way to actually make the end users speak about the effect and the impact in their lives based on what the work of the portfolio companies and, in fact, Acumen as a whole has been doing. So I was curious to better understand how all these pieces fit together. There's lots of various initiatives in different regions across the capital spectrum, from early stage entrepreneurs all the way through to growth capital via our funds. And at the same time, I was excited to make sure that we solve the problems of poverty, which is the overall mandate, but it's quite broad. And of course, being an IMM professional, I wanted to seek out how IMM can drive clarity and utility, and not just focused on that evidence, but actually to try to magnify impact. And what I'll share today is really how at Acumen, there are a couple of unique factors of how IMM can demonstrate systems thinking, and the work is still ongoing, but also what it can look like in practice based on what choice set I had along the way. So the first one is really to acknowledge in the next slide is that Acumen operates across different sectors in different regions, but the real orientation starts with the problem. And that by itself is, even if we didn't coin it as such at the time, is a systems thinking approach where you recognize what is actually the problem that we're trying to solve. So for that, we have, and we also care about the people living in poverty. So we have a strong focus on the people and how is our investing work ultimately affecting their lives. So what I ended up developing is this recognition of, like, we'll have an amazing data set. We're actually using the customer voice of our work in a central way. And in fact, we managed to reach up to 500 million last year and now 648 million this year accumulatively. So it is a big reach number. But I was keen to also understand, well, what does that look like from the customer point of view in relation to the problem, as well as ultimately our sphere of influence as an investor is the company. Who do we choose for our portfolio? But then also, how does that link back to the system and the problem that we're trying to solve? So I had a choice set because initially there were lots of donor demands. We work with philanthropic donors as well as returnable capital. So there were different practices from both monitoring and evaluation and learning from the development sector, as well as the sort of newly emerging IMM practices that we tend to use in impact investing. And I think it's been exciting to be able to work with what we've got and then enhance it. And I think that's what you'll see in the second slide, where we were asked initially to really think about what is an overall theory of change, what are the 3 KPIs that we can work with across Acumen everywhere. And it's like, well, that's not particularly useful. So what I wanted to do is really dedicate the wider approach, but then dive into what does it look like per initiative. So here you'll see a very simplified theory of change where you see the inputs across our initiatives is our capital, our personnel, and our alliances. Then we invest, we build company capacity. We also engage with the larger investing ecosystem through insights generation. So we really have that learning part already embedded. This is one of our initiatives that focused on 25 to 20, or around 25 investments, but also the other things what we do is technical assistance and convening thought pieces and events that really allowed us to cross-collaborate with the different stakeholders. But ultimately, of course, we want to make sure that the companies really improve their financial growth, but also which are the bigger effects that we want to see, which include gender equity. At the moment, we're also focusing on resilience and making sure that smallholders in our approach are key to ag systems more broadly in the regions where we operate. So if you go to the final piece, you'll see the levels where you connect back to what's happening at the individual level, what happens with the company, and what needs to happen more broadly, is trying to include that into the pathways of our theories of change. And that looks different. The KPIs initially for an ecosystem were usually like thought pieces or convenings held, but actually I think we need to step it all up and see what it is that we can build beyond the talking and saying that we must all work better together. And that's, I think, also a way of where we are now with the opportunities of systems thinking. So when you think about what are the hooks in which this shows up? It's really about how can you utilize IMM practices to really make this come to life? And this is where there's two big moments, I think, typically the pre-investment moment, the deal or no deal, that's basically it. So you need to make sure that you understand that alignment across those three levels for every deal that you make, but also more broadly, how do you build your portfolio? And in our case, what we do is we do an impact assessment per company. So we start with the company data because, of course, that's our entity. But again, we use the customer voice as well via 60 decibel studies. And there we want to make sure that those three parameters that are building across, so the KPIs or the pillars that we see as impact, are meeting our mandate, which is the poverty focus, the breadth of impact, and the depth of impact. So we want to see that at the individual level, but also more broadly at the company level. And what does that look like more broadly? Now, what that looks like more broadly, you can't monitor very easily. So what's really important is post-investment, in the next slide, is that we take a wider lens to our effect. So beyond transactions and individuals, what can our impact measurement really tell us? And how can we utilize annual review to not just bring together a pretty set of slides for a report, but actually unpack what does it mean for us and how can we do deep dive studies and insights generation to understand what that wider shift is. And if we're not delivering that wider shift, what it is we can do. So we really want to focus, my mantra remains impact measurement for action. If you're not using it for anything, then you lose it. So I want to make sure that we always keep impact management key and center. And I think this is also where post-investment, the systems thinking can really come out to make sure that we use this for ongoing performance management and impact magnification. So what that means in many ways, system thinking and system change is quite a big word, and people tend to get quite you tend to lose people quite easily with a lot of concepts. But what I think it's important to understand, all of us are the system. We are the actors in this system. So if you bring it back to a couple of questions that I found useful to what you can do if you want to start applying this, the three that I highlighted on the next slide is really trying to bring the conceptual back to the actionable. So whether you're investing, measuring impact, or running a company, you can expand your system perspective. So it's about the opening up the mindset, as Karim said, but with an eye towards action. There's no point in us all of like comprehensively mapping out lots of comprehensive abstract things, but then not actually acting on it. So for me, what I found useful across wherever you sit across the spectrum, think about what else matters here, what influences my outcome. Secondly, how do our actions affect people and interactions around us? We don't operate in a vacuum, but at the same time, we need to focus on our sphere of influence and control to enhance that. And that brings me to the last point, is what do we need to shift to improve wider outcomes? And I think I'm still very much part of this. So fast forward today, I don't have all the answers, but I'm excited to be part of these explorations with the orientation towards action and what must be done rather than what must be thought about. So the thinking to me is always should be in favor of the action. And in many cases, we need to act before we can think about it. So I'm actually always continuing with my mantra, the impact measurement for action, but also how can we be more realistic rather than specific in terms of rigorous evidence, data point, and singular indicators towards like, there's wider interactions to the problems that we're trying to solve, and we must acknowledge that in not just the way we measure it, but also in the way we act.
Great. Thank you, Julia. And as you can see, and many of you are familiar with some of the work that's come out of Acumen and as well as 60 decibels, this idea of bringing different forms of data, legitimizing that in a way not only for Acumen but also for other investors, and thinking about the different ways in which the voice of users and customers comes in, but also, as Julia mentioned, working through this at multiple levels across your investment process. So everything from pre-investment to post-investment for individual clusters, through to broader portfolios and even across different sectors. It's reconceptualizing the ways that we think about how we work, both in terms of the data, but also how we work across teams. And we'll talk a little bit about shortly, what does it take to do this well within organizations? Because certainly some of what we've explained might be things you're already doing, but in other cases you might want to be able to start. So how would you be able to start bringing some of the ethos and practices that we've just explained into your organizations as well? Before we do that, I wanted to give Alex a chance to chime in here because I've appreciated the opportunity to work with RPA and the Shifting Systems Initiative, which was initially conceived around these ideas of thinking of systems change and systems lenses for philanthropy, and is now, over the last few years, moved more deliberately into impact investing. I worked with the team 4 or 5 years ago now on the handbook, where we mentioned some of the initial thinking around this was inspired by. And since then, there's been a lot of knowledge, convening, and just sense making around what are we looking around and seeing both family offices, foundations, other kinds of impact investors think about these kinds of questions, and what are the ways in which the current moment invites us to think differently about the ways in which system perspectives come into our work. So Alex, if you can come in here now and just talk about what you're observing and any reflections on what you've heard from Julia and Lydia in terms of their own work.
Thank you, Kareem. A pleasure to be here and have this discussion. I come to this with a more of a ecosystem perspective. We at RPA were born out of the Rockefeller Family Office with a mission to accelerate philanthropy and the transformation for a just world. And within that context, we've been working with donors of all sorts to try to see how we can maximize their impact or help them maximize their impact. And within that concept, soon the concept of systems change emerged, out of the reasons that Kareem, you mentioned before, which was, frustration with limited impact, recognition of complexity, and so forth. And that's why RPA, and by the way, I'm going to stick only to one slide after so much rich and beautiful content having been shared. So RP established this, what you see here, the Shifting Systems Initiative in 2016 with a number of leading funders to talk about, how do we go from this very complex concept to action? It is very daunting. A lot of people get put off by that. And with help of some of the funders you see, the School, Ford, Packard Foundation, and others, create a community practice saying, so how do you apply this? No? And soon enough, we did learn, that it's not only the what matters, but also the how and what instruments you use, right? And that's true for grant making. There's a different way of grant making and a different way of measuring and different way of looking at things from a grant making perspective when you take a systems lens. But we also realize that the same way when you deal with a system, you have to think of many different stakeholders. You also need to think about different capital providers and sources of capital along the entire continuum. And that's why we've not abandoned our mission, which is in the space of philanthropy, but we think expansively. How do we can mobilize more forms of capital more effectively towards impact? And what we've been observing is that more foundations have been moving in this territory precisely because they see that only with one approach or just the traditional grant-making approach, they can't achieve the impact at the scale that they're seeking to do. No? And that's why we partner with Kareem. It's a pleasure to be here to develop practical frameworks and tools that help integrate systems thinking into the way impact investments are strategized, operated, measured, and managed. And we don't see ourselves as owners of this space. We're trying to elevate it through this initiative. There's a community of practice and to elevate and create visibility for actors who are already doing very good work in this space. Now, and Kareem has mentioned some like Twist and Transcap and so others. No? So we're actively working in this space to share this knowledge because there is a lot of good work being done already out there. But as always, we work in a very fragmented and sometimes inefficient ecosystem. So this is what we're trying to do with these webinars and with these collaborations. I did throw into the chat the link towards the Shifting Systems Initiative webpage, and where you can find the primer that Karim has been referring to. So it's a pleasure to be here in such good company and working with leaders and practitioners in this field. And with you, Karim, I think we will. There's a lot to this space, and I see a lot of appetite. If something we can provide is perspective, transversal perspective, because we deal with so many funders, and there's a lot of energy and interest in this. So I look forward to continuing to engage on this. Over to you, Karim.
Right. Thank you, Alex. And yeah, as Alex mentioned, the primer is up. We would love your feedback on it, because this is the first in a series of things that we want to be able to share with you as part of this work of making really the kind of practices, the insights, the shifts more accessible to all of you. I can see just briefly in the chat, there's so much interest and also variation from where you're coming from, that we've tried to provide a range of entry points, and hopefully it resonates with you. But we'd love to get your feedback on it as you are thinking about how it might be useful to your work. I'm going to now get into some of our discussion and Q&A, and stick around, because we will spend a few minutes later to preview some of the tools, and we'll give you some very practical tips on how to begin to do this. So if you have to hop off, that's fine, but I would encourage you to stick to the end. We will end on time. But I do want to check in with Lydia and Julia again, because one of the questions that I think I certainly struggle with, and I know we all do when we're working within organizations and with others, what does it take to do this kind of work? How do you do it well? Because as we're working with others within our organizations across different teams, I mean, Julia and Lydia, both of you have roles that are focused on both impact measurement as well as learning. What advice would you give us around how you do this well, and what do organizations need to think about building in order to have the internal enablers and capabilities to do this? So maybe Lydia, we'll start with you.
Sure thing. Thank you. I think in terms of doing it well and building on kind of what Julia said in her presentation, it's really about the kind of the doing and and giving things a go. It's that, I think I talked about it a bit in my presentation. It's that pragmatism and trying things and not seeking perfection is really important, I think, in this work. It can be very overwhelming. The kind of the language of systems change can feel like, I saw a question in the chat about how do you get started with systems mapping. I think it can feel very like, where do you start? Where do you even kind of, where's the first point? I think you've presented some really useful resources to help, but I found, particularly from an impact and evaluation perspective, I think balancing that pragmatism that I spoke about. When it came to developing our KPIs, we were not starting from scratch. Organizations have done a lot of this work. They have a lot of the thinking, often just maybe not presented in the kind of the language or the framing of systems change. So, what data do you already have? What evidence do you already have about what's working, what isn't working? What do you know? You might not have called them leverage points, but what do you know about the kind of things, the kind of interventions you've tried on a more systemic level before, and kind of where can you replicate those? So I think for us, it was, like I said, we really focused in on what did we already have in place. We had KPIs we hadn't been reviewing and we hadn't been using so much. So kind of what could we take from those, and how can we make them practical and something that we could really learn from? Yes, so I'll leave it there and let you.
Lydia, just as a follow-up for you, before we go to Julia, one of the things that I found really interesting is that you work very closely with your board through this process. So that's sometimes a challenging thing for larger organizations to do. You're lucky that you've got a really tight, good relationships, and you're smaller. So in some ways, you can bridge those divides. Any reflections, insights, or advice around how to cultivate that kind of working relationship across not only just the organization and your colleagues, but also with the board?
Absolutely. I think we're really lucky to have such a good relationship. I mean, we talked about, Karim mentioned Emily, who's involved in this work. That was having a champion on our board makes a massive difference, I think. But still, we didn't get it totally right. We all, as team members, attend our board. But we took a paper to them about systems change last year, which was saying, we want to try and take a systems approach to our new strategy. It really didn't land very well. I think they were worried we were going to go down a kind of rabbit hole of complexity. So we went away, we applied the tools, we took it back in practical terms, we showed them the KPIs, and I think it's about doing, not showing and doing rather than kind of telling them what we're going to do. So yeah, that's it.
Thanks, Lydia. And it's a really good point because this came up in our discussion a couple of weeks ago at the Scorewell Forum, where one piece of advice was maybe sometimes systems thinking and systems change doesn't resonate, and think about the ways in which you can bring in these practices and ideas into the work rather than having to use necessarily the labels. Julia, again, yeah, advice around what it takes to do this well and other enablers and ways in which you can bring others along with you.
Yeah, I think this is a really good point. And I feel like impact professionals in particular, we're quite good at dancing between the levels because that's what our work demands of us. We need to have the top line clear. We need to go all the way down to data points and back again. And I think that's really what's helped us, and me in particular, to navigate that some stakeholders in leadership and board, they want to know the top headlines because they care and think about the organization and the scale of our impact. Then in terms of how to speak with our regional offices, they have a more narrow and proximate context to the work, the problems, as well as their investment strategy. So what they end up engaging with is at the different levels, it's focusing more on that strategy and what the success look like there is different. And then, of course, when you talk to the companies, you need to connect it back to the customer and their business model. So I feel like having that ability to speak to the different people and not trying to come up with one thing, because I agree that typically a system map actually puts off people. You need to have enough clarity with the right people to be able to go, and then don't get stuck in months of paper shifting this thing away because it's just not going to really speak to people. So for me, actually, I find what really helped is the right conversations, bringing people along. It requires the framing and what is the hook. Well, I always start with the hook, what is on their mind, and then bring in impact and the systems thinking accordingly, rather than coming at it from, let's talk about systems, because then it's vague to begin with. So what's worked well for me is framing, using hooks, and then demonstrate value. Why does it matter? And which questions can add value to people's work? And it's not about the answer or the data points per se. It's like, how can your questioning or offering of insights or like exploring data together add value rather than think in visual data points or the best page in an impact report. And I think the final thing I will say is it does require a mandate and money. So in our case, we have an insights and strategy team, which is tasked with asking the right questions and rising above to create the sum of the parts being larger. And it needs money. We need time to explore this. You need the right exploration. You can't jump through this quickly. And this is also what I think is a risk to the system momentum. Unless we connect it to action and building, this could, again, be lots of people with great working groups talking and repeating certain things that are not necessarily connecting us to a bigger drive. So I'm keen to see more of that, and I try to role model that as best I can at Acumen and beyond.
Thanks, Julia. And yeah, just to amplify that, this is really driving some of this work is to just show what we're already doing and make it a little less intimidating by providing these entry points and combinations. I'm going to ask Alex one more question, then we'll get into the tools because I know we're rapidly running out of time, but if you can bear with us for a few more minutes, I think you'll enjoy sticking around. Alex, one of the questions or things we've been trying to do through this work is not only look inward at what's happening, but also begin to think about how we might bridge conventional sectors and silos through different mechanisms, right? It's understanding what's happening, providing some ways to bring this knowledge together. As we've seen already, convening 200 plus people on a webinar. What are some things we can do around how to make sure that this kind of way of working and thinking is just more prevalent and that we can accelerate that kind of practices that Julia was also referring to?
Thanks for a good question, Kareem. And one of the part of the answer is what we're just doing right now. I mean, getting the community together, this type of webinar. that is also the very reason why we decided to do this work together, come up with this primer and also work with the other leaders in this field, Twist and so forth, to share and elevate and disseminate this knowledge. As I said before, the knowledge is very fragmented and very dispersed, and so we need to create more platforms, more bridges, and that's why also we're collaborating not only with these communities like Twist, but also with the other platforms around the world. Because by the way, we're seeing a lot of interest everywhere. This is not only a North type discussion. I mean, there's amazing innovations in this space in Latin America. We've done a lot of work, no? So we're going to be placing this discussion and activating this discussion in many places. As a matter of fact, this week, one of my colleagues, Heather, is in Tokyo with Alison Ford from Twist, speaking about this precisely with the community in East Asia. We're going to be in Latin America, Medellin, at the end of August. Hopefully together, Karim, you and I, talking about this with ABPA Nairobi, GIN, Impact Europe, hopefully. So basically, we have to engage the community worldwide because there's a lot of valuable experience and also a huge appetite to learn these tools, and examples like you described, Julia, and also Lydia. For many actors are looking for this. So that's what we're trying to do. And that's a collective effort. That's not us, right? That's all of us. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex. And yeah, just to say that we have a few more resources that we're going to be rolling out, different case studies, tools, and also a learning cohort later. So if you're interested, get in touch with us. As a preview to some of the tools, and thank you for sticking with us, I'll be 2 minutes just to give you a sense of what's coming. We developed a playbook to be able to then guide you through each of the different parts of how impact investors generally think about their work, both in impact investing and impact measurement. And so you can see here, you've got a series of tools and worksheets around how you can begin to get started, just around what are your expectations and beliefs around systems change, how do you map onto the 6 different components, then begin to map and trace further into your investment processes in different ways and think about where systems thinking is already integrated or where you could begin to do some new things. This includes both informal processes around investment as well as policy statements or investment policy statements. And then for the rest of us that love IMM, we usually already use things like theories of change, the IMP dimensions, and increasingly thinking about impact risk. How do we bring systems thinking into that to be more expansive? But also, as both Lydia and Julia have shown, just to be able to manage that in the way that we work with our colleagues. And so this is what's coming. These are accessible tools. They look like this. For those of you that have seen some of the work we've done previously on the project Grand Ventures at the Helm, where we've provided worksheets and tools for both social ventures and investors. In a similar way, we've tried to bring a set of guides and guidance in a pretty accessible way, regardless of where you are. So you'll see this, sent out in the email next week to you. And we would love to see how you are using those and how we can improve the uptake. Some very quick things to get you started as you think about how you begin to do this. For those of you that are already working on impact investing strategies, you can begin to ask some new questions as you consider your next investment. How might you think about both direct and indirect users, beneficiaries, stakeholders? What are the ripple effects of the ways in which you might think about the positive and negative effects of your investments? And these days, in the realm of complexity, we have to acknowledge both of those. And what are some other ways you might think about what success looks like? And again, you've got some really great, I think, inspiration from both how Acumen and Access have been thinking about that. And you can just get started by mapping. There are resources that we are able to share and we'll link to. You can begin to think about not just direct products or services, but leverage points in the system, and just begin to introduce system level indicators into your IMM frameworks. For those of you that are working on IMM specifically, look at your KPIs again, as you saw Lydia has done. Think about this relationship between the direct work and the systemic outcomes. Maybe rethink the way you are looking at KPIs to prioritize things like ecosystem health, policy and market dynamics, as well as even power and inclusion. And then think about how you might begin to introduce more data sources, new perspectives, and kinds of evidence, including things like ripple effect mapping, interviews, and storytelling. There's a lot more here. This is just a sneak peek into the kind of work we've both been doing over the last year, but also we'll be learning in the program in a few months. So if you're interested, get in touch with us. Alex already shared the link to the Shifting Systems Initiative, where we've already launched the primer and the tools are coming. Those of you that are also interested in how we bring aspects of measurement to be more meaningful to organizations and the people most affected by it, a couple of weeks ago at the Skoll Center, we launched the Meaningful Measurement Playbook with the old fire station. You can take a look at that. It's a really great resource. And for those of you that are interested in, again, this intersection between how we be creative around systems thinking and structures around impact finance, we have a webinar coming up in about 10 days with Ani Panpower and Chintan Panchal and I talking about other aspects of innovative finance and also the program that we run in November. So this was a lot. We appreciate your patience. Apologies for running over. We want to give you this kind of coverage of both the research, the perspectives, and a sneak peek into the tools, but also to show you that there's a lot more to come. Thank you for being with us. We would love to hear from you around your questions, what you'd like to see more of, and also how you might want to continue to engage with us. So with that, I'll sign off and look forward to seeing you at our next webinar in just about 10 days. Thank you.